Is everybody in? Is everybody in? Is everybody in? The ceremony is about to begin.
This is very real.
Fantastic.
This drug is dangerous.
Wrong.
You cannot play with it. It's not funny. It's not something to laugh about. Good people don't smoke marijuana.
Shut your little punk ass up.
But the more you hate me, the more you will learn.
Welcome to episode 60 of the Autoflower podcast, where we chat with growers, breeders, and anyone relevant to the Autoflower cannabis community. I'm Chad, I'm your host. I'm a fellow Autoflower cannabis home grower, and I appreciate you joining us here. Big shout out to new Patreon members Max Autos and Kit Wiederson. Your support is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for signing up. For those of you who have been patiently waiting for more flowering club spots to open, I did open up another 25 spots on Patreon. And speaking of the flowering club, being that I send out seeds to those members, and with the podcast receiving a large surge of new listeners lately, I want to give a quick reminder regarding those seeds. As I've stated before, and as it states in the sign-up details, I am not an experienced or an established breeder. I consider myself an absolute newbie when it comes to plant breeding in general. With that said, I know how hard it is to blow through a good chunk of money on seeds when you're starting out. A $10 or a $15 seed it's easy to mess up when you're learning. And although those genetics are worth every penny, in my opinion, it's nice to have a less expensive option to practice with. Now, there's no shortage of growers like myself pollinating plants to produce seeds. But many of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, could care less, at least it seems like they could care less about genetics, ethics, and integrity when doing so. Facebook, in particular, is full of people selling seeds that half of the time they don't germinate, they won't flower unless you change the light cycle, which kind of defeats the purpose of autoflowers. I see quite a few hermaphrodites, and a lot of them just don't really look that well, if I'm honest with you. So I see it all the time, and it gives me even more encouragement and motivation to provide some decent genetics that, although they aren't anywhere near what breeders like Night Owl and Mephisto and Gnome Automatics or Fast Buds produces, they are indeed 100% autoflowers from a selection that grow easy, they look good, they smell good, they taste good, and they feel good, you know what I mean? So if you're interested in early access to episodes and free seeds every 3 months, head over to patreon.com/autoflowerpodcast and sign up for the Flowering Club. All right, thank you for allowing me to get that out of the way. I'm excited about our topic this week. We're going to chat about harvesting, drying, and curing your cannabis to have optimal results in your final product. This is something that I have struggled with throughout the years, so I'm really excited to chat about this. I'm even more excited and honored to have Chris, also known as Mr.GrowIt, join us as our guest. Chris has an amazing and humble attitude when it comes to growing. He has a very informative YouTube channel where he documents and provides education. He co-hosts a podcast with Rob from Cannabis Life TV and Pigeons 420 from YouTube. He hosts his own Garden Talk podcast, has a great informative website, and he has a book out called 7 Steps to Grow Cannabis, a complete beginner's guide to growing cannabis indoors. So please welcome to the Autoflower podcast, Mr.GrowIt. If you would just introduce yourself and just tell us about, I know you've got a couple of podcasts of your own, so if you could tell us about those, and so that we can have everyone go check those out as well, that'd be great.
Sure. My name's Chris. A lot of people know me as Mr.GrowIt.
Started growing in 2010, so I'm just finishing up 11 years growing cannabis in particular. Really started doing I did the same thing for the first 6 years of my grow career, I guess you can call it. I would grow in soil, Fox Farm Ocean Forest soil, HID lighting, Fox Farm nutrients. And really what kind of, I guess, broke me on my shell or encouraged me to try new methods is when I got on YouTube. So when I found out that people were uploading videos of them growing on YouTube, I didn't know that was even allowed back then. Prohibition land, that was back in 2013, 14, 15. I really kind of tried other things, growing in cocoa is another alternate method, switching over to LED. But there are so many different ways to grow this plant. And, I got to give credit where credit is due. Is there other YouTubers out there who had these different methods? So that's kind of encouraged me to try new methods. I uploaded my first video in 2015 on a channel that unfortunately no longer exists. YouTube canned that channel. I had the channel for about 6 months. Then I turned it into a community channel where folks would upload. They would submit in videos to be featured on there. So I had some of the best growers from around the world submitting in videos, and I'd feature a new video every single day. I had about 640 something videos, I believe, on that channel before it was terminated. And so that was a huge heartbreaker to the community, huge blow to the community. I had my other channel. I launched another personal channel that's still active today. It's I think I just past 210,000 subscribers, where I just upload my garden. It's just me in my garden kind of showing what I do with my plants. I'm not an expert. I don't claim to be an expert or a scientist or anything like that. I'm just a small home grower. I grow 12 plants maximum. That's what I can do in my state. And then just showing what I do, and hopefully people will, follow along and, like the videos and potentially steal some best practices, things that they want to take and implement in their garden. And that's kind of my whole goal of my channel. Also have another channel, which I launched shortly after my main channel. It's a talk channel, and it's more of a clean side of things where I incorporate all plants into it, right? So it's not just cannabis. I'm talking about all plants, vegetables. I started growing vegetables about 3-4 years ago now. So I'm pretty much new to vegetables is what I like to tell people, although people say, hey, you've been growing that for a while now. Don't consider yourself new. But anyways, that's the talk channel. I have a podcast, which you mentioned, Garden Talk with Mr.GrowIt, where I talk one-on-one with growers from all over the world. And that has really taken off. I'm just thrilled by how large of a fan base that has created just in the matter of, I really got serious with it this year. So less than 1 year, and it's getting anywhere from 15,000 plus views per episode just on YouTube, and it's also on all the other podcast platforms as well. And then the last thing I'll mention is the From the Stash podcast. That's the other podcast I'm a part of. It's not just me; it's also Rob from Cannabis Lifestyle TV and Pigeons 420. And on that podcast, we talked about all things cannabis related. So there's a little quick synopsis, quick little introduction about kind of how I got into growing and kind of what I got going on and the podcast I'm doing today.
Awesome, man. Well, congratulations on the success, man. That's great to hear. That's awesome. I've, like I said earlier, I've been binge watching some of your videos. They're really informative. When it's just two guys, you and another, you guys just, or a girl, and you guys just sit down and chat just about a variety of different subjects and topics. So, and I've learned a lot just over in this last week. Binge watching your videos. So congratulations, man, and thank you for those videos as well. Really appreciate it.
Thanks. That's really cool to hear. Yeah, that's the whole goal of things is for people to listen in and potentially learn. And I'm learning right along with a lot of the people that are listening. So yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, I think we're always learning, no matter, and it could be a variety of different subjects or hobbies or whatever it is. There's just always an opportunity to learn and grow. And when we get a community surrounded around that and, this whole idea of like iron sharpens iron, it just kind of helps everybody out, just I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but it's just awesome when a lot of people can get together and be beneficial to one another, It's really cool.
Absolutely.
So yeah, if we could chat, I wanted to really chat with you about harvesting and drying and curing. I know that you exclusively grow photoperiod cannabis plants. I think you mentioned you have grown autos, but you don't anymore, correct?
Yeah, I've grown probably in total maybe about 24 autoflower plants total. That's it. So,
Okay.
so I do have some experience with autoflowers, right? But I'm not. I mostly grow photoperiod for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think, those are kind of where the lines can blur, and where drying and harvesting, drying, curing especially can be pretty much the same thing. It's cannabis. Obviously just a different light schedule and things like that, but yeah, because like I said, I admittedly suck at drying and curing. I happen to, well, if where you live is probably similar to here, well, probably worse. I live in Southern California in the Inland Empire, and it's kind of this weird pocket where it's kind of deserty, and it gets really hot in the summer. Even today, it's supposed to be 90, and it's really dry, man. I have a hard time keeping my humidity up, whereas someone on the East Coast or in the South is going to have a really hard time keeping their humidity down. And so I find that I run into issues as far as trying to keep my environment ideal. But if we could just maybe chat like about ideal environment and humidity, temperature, length of time, and stuff like that, I think it would kind of help everyone out across the board. So I guess typically when it comes to harvesting, I kind of want to back up a little bit almost and even talk about a flush, because some people will kind of consider that the beginning process. With the idea of flushing, do you flush, and what are your thoughts on flushing? I recently watched a video, I forget who it was, but they were actually interviewing a couple of people from some university or some place, I think it was, and it was, they were explaining how flushing it doesn't take any nutrients out of your plant, but it does something there. I don't know if you've seen that video or if you know what I'm talking about, but what are your thoughts on flushing?
Yeah, so I've actually created a video on that study that I believe you're referring to. So if I'm correct, it was a study done by RX Green Technologies. I'm not sure if that rings a bell for you.
That's the one.
Yeah, so they did a study on flushing. I created a whole video on this explaining it, and I actually give my thoughts on flushing, but I'll talk about it here as well. So they did a study where they flushed some plants. They didn't flush some plants. Long story short, I won't go over all the details about the study. Just search RX Green Technologies flushing study, and you'll see the whole study, and you'll be able to read it for yourself. But basically what they found is no difference between flushed versus unflushed buds when it comes to the nutrient content within the bud, THC content, I believe it was terpene content, yield, I forget what else they mentioned. I know they also looked at like the color of the ash, whether it be a black ash or a gray ash. They also had a panel of people that were smoking the cannabis and then seeing, their opinion, what one tasted better, the flushed or unflushed buds. Now, I believe, if I remember correctly, that most of the people had mentioned that unflushed buds actually taste better. Now, that's super subjective, right? I mean, this is something that is just, it needs to be factual and repeatable in order for us to come to that statement that, hey, flushing is not beneficial, My opinion is, one thing that they didn't look at is chlorophyll. They didn't look at what the chlorophyll content is. Now, I think that's something that a lot of us know is during the drying and curing process, if you try to smoke the cannabis right away after you harvest it, you can taste the chlorophyll in it, right? There's that green taste, as some people refer to it as. But over time, that chlorophyll is going to break down. Now, my stance on this is I feel like they should have done some sort of chlorophyll measurement on flush versus unflushed buds so we can see if the flush buds did have kind of a head start I guess you can say, on the drying and curing process, right? And it led to a faster cure. That's something I'd like to see. I personally do. Flushing, there's a couple different terms for it, right? Are we talking about flushing as in putting a large amount of water through the medium in order to reduce the ppm or EC, whatever you measure? Or are we talking about leaching? So just not feeding nutrients and just feeding water for the remaining week or 2 weeks or however long that flush period is. For what I usually do is really mostly leaching now. If I feel like I've over fertilized, I will do like kind of a flush, right, and kind of bring that ppm down towards the end of the grow. But that hasn't happened to me in a while because I've figured things out over the years as far as overfeeding. And that's one of the reasons why I think people used to really push flush, is because people used to pump, back in the day, we're talking 10, 15, 20 years ago, people used to pump their plants with nutrients all the way up until the end, especially when hydroponics was like at an all-time high as far as popularity. So people would harvest and it tastes like crap because they over-fertilized. So I feel like this whole flushing thing really comes down to if you've over-fertilized your plant or not. If you haven't over-fertilized your plant, you're naturally going to see a senescence in the plant, right? You're naturally going to see that plant fade. The leaves are going to fade into a yellow, for example, right? It's an annual plant, right? Cannabis is an annual plant. It's going to automatically die no matter what, even if there's a ton of nutrients in the medium. So for me personally, as long as I see that gradual senescence, that gradual fade of the leaves, I'm okay with harvesting at that point. Now, whether or not you call that a flush, I'll leave that up to you. I do typically cut off nutrients, right, when I'm growing in soil. The last week or two, I don't feed nutrients, right? I feed water, and then I get that natural fade. Well, somewhat of I guess you could say it might be a forced fade in a sense, but I do get that fade before harvest. That's kind of my goal. So there have been plants where I fed all the way up until the end, and I still got that natural senescence, that natural fade, and I was okay with that, and I felt like the final product wasn't any difference. So there's background on that study that you're referring to, and also kind of my thoughts on flushing.
Yeah. That must have been your video that I watched, now that I'm thinking of it. I wonder if it was. I thought it might have been the MyGrowIt guy talking to them, if I wasn't
mistaken. He made
mistaken.
one too.
Okay, I think that's the one I saw. Yeah, that's interesting. I typically grow organically, and so some of the, as far as the autoflowers anyways, a lot of them won't fade. They will if you let them go long enough, but I tend to harvest a little earlier than most, I guess. And so I don't always wait for the plant to fade. Oftentimes they do, but a lot of times they don't. But I guess if you were to, flush or leach, like you're saying, for the last couple of weeks, it would obviously begin to starve the plant where it would fade regardless. So it is a beautiful thing to see. I do love it when the fall colors come and you see your plant begin to fade and stuff. It's just a beautiful sight in general.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the whole organic thing, because that's one thing I didn't touch on, is like, I think it's generally accepted that if you're growing organically, there is no such thing as a flush. You shouldn't be flushing, running water through the medium at the last few weeks of the grow. Or, I don't think a lot of people, organic growers, really do any type of top dressing, for example, which is a form of feeding in the last 2 weeks. So I guess you could say they are kind of leaching in a way.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what way you look at it. Yeah, so let's chat about, like, as far as bud maturity, trichome development. What things are you looking for when you go to harvest? Do you solely go off the trichomes? Are you kind of looking at the trichomes as well as the pistils and just the overall size of the flowers? And some people prefer to harvest when there's a 30% amber trichomes, or some, I tend to harvest when they're mostly cloudy and there's like maybe 10%. What's your personal, I know everyone's got their own opinions in different ways, but what is your personal the way of doing that?
Yeah, and that's another thing that's pretty subjective, right? Because some people are, I think it's, a lot of people know is that different color trichomes are going to give you kind of those different effects, right? So clear trichomes, they say, are not matured yet, If you harvest when most of your trichomes are clear, you could have like a racy, paranoid type high, and it might not last very long. Cloudy is when it's at its highest potency. So that's generally deemed as being the best time to harvest is when most of your trichomes are cloudy, and that's what I aim for. I look for most of the trichomes to be cloudy, and then when the trichomes have actually changed to amber, it said that it's actually converted from THC to CBN, so a different cannabinoid. And then eventually, I'm not sure if you know this or a lot of people know this, but eventually that trichome actually will fall off. It'll break and fall off if you let the plant go long enough. So I don't really look for a specific percentage of amber. I mean, when I'm looking at mostly cloudy, there are going to be some amber. Percentage wise, it's kind of hard for me to tell you what percentage that is. Probably around 10%, I guess. But I do take a microscope. Well, actually nowadays I use my phone. A lot of people don't know that you can actually just take a close-up picture with your phone and then take that picture and zoom into that picture, and you can see the color of the trichomes with most smartphones. I know definitely with the new Apple iPhone, I use the Pixel 5 right now, the Samsung phone. I mean, a lot of these new phones now, you can just zoom in and see the color of the trichomes. So really, I mean, a lot of people don't even need a microscope anymore to look at the trichomes.
Yeah.
But yeah, mostly cloudy is kind of what I'm aiming for.
Yeah, same here. And I find that, like you had mentioned, so when they go amber, it actually turns from, like more THC to more a different cannabinoid like CBN. And that may be great for somebody who is targeting that cannabinoid in particular. I know that there are, some certain medical patients who seek that out, CBG, CBN, depending. And or if you just like more of that kind of sedative couch lock, stony stone feeling, I guess. I think that tends to kind of give you that a little more as well.
Absolutely, that's definitely a great point.
So what about as far as so when harvest day comes? Well, actually before that, do you try to not water for a certain amount of time or get your last watering in and then wait a certain amount of time before chopping for any moisture purposes or anything like that?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. One thing, I'm sorry, let's go back to the other question. I didn't actually answer when you said pistils. I do kind of look at the pistils. So I apologize for not mentioning that. I do somewhat look at the pistils. Now, the pistils turning from white to orange or a brown and start to recede. I do keep an eye out for that. That's one of the indicators I can see as the plant's kind of slowing down on growth. I don't really look at the fatness of it. Now, most of the plants that I harvest, there's still going to be some white pistils. Now, it's a common question is, should all the pistils have turned to brown? And the answer to that for me is no. I don't always look to make sure that every single pistil on the bud is turned. So if there's a couple white pistils, that's fine. And then your question about watering, do I water before harvest? Was that what the question was?
Yeah, like a lot of people will try to will say, make sure that your last watering is at least, so many days or even a week before you harvest. There will be too much moisture in the plant or things like that. What's your opinion on that, or what is your method?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't really monitor that very much. When the plant's ready to harvest, I'll harvest it. I'll definitely make sure it's watered all the way up until harvest, right? So if like the plant needs water a day before it's harvested, I'll water it. I make sure it's not too dry. I've harvested plants, unfortunately, that were too dry, and it led to a faster dry, which I didn't like. I live in a very dry climate. I'm sure we'll get into when we talk about drying here. But it sort of, I would say, over-dried the plant. It caused it to dry too quickly, and I unfortunately over-dried the plant, and my final product wasn't as good. So I do personally like to make sure at least there is some sort of moisture within the medium, and can safely assume that that's also, within the plant. And then you get into the whole hours of darkness before harvest thing. I'm not sure if that's on your list of things to talk about, but some people will put their plants into a period of darkness, whether it be 24 hours or 48 hours or 72 hours of darkness, then they'll harvest. Now I sometimes do that. There's no fine science behind it saying that, yes, this is beneficial as far as trichome development. The theory is that, secondary metabolites such as trichomes are created during lights off. So giving that plant the additional darkness, it's causing it to create more trichomes last minute, like a last ditch effort to create more trichomes. Now, the objection to that, the other side of the debate is, well, sure, you might be generating some trichomes, but they're not matured, right? They're not into cloudy state. They're not going into amber state, right? So there hasn't really been any studies that I'm aware of that talk about the 48 hours of darkness. I know there have been some YouTubers who have done their own little personal studies and posted videos on it. But as far as somebody using the scientific method and having repeatable results, I don't think that exists right now.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about like the environment difference, because that's kind of where things, for me, on Facebook, there's these groups and there's so much arguing online and stuff with know-it-alls, and it's really hard for me to be on any Facebook groups, if I'm honest with you.
Same.
Yeah, it's really weird, man. Like Instagram seems pretty cool. You get your soapbox guys here and there, but yeah, Facebook is just loaded, man. And you had mentioned how you live in a dry environment, and I know we'll get more into depth on that, but this is why, there is really no kind of one answer fits all across the board. Depending on your environment and stuff. I do the same as you. I'll water as needed, and when I'm ready to harvest, I just simply harvest it. I won't focus on any type of watering beforehand or anything like that. But I don't want my plant to dry out too much either, because I also live in a dry environment. So I'm just glad you touched on that. So you do darkness. What about, is there any other things you do, like as far as some people pour ice into their pots and allow the ice to melt and get the roots super cold, and they do all kinds of voodoo stuff like that? Are you into any of that stuff?
I don't do ice flushing. I do like to give lower the temps, old school trick, lower the temps towards the end of flowering, and then some of the colors will come out. Obviously it's going to depend on genetics, right? Different cultivars are going to fade out differently, but I found cold temps, I like to lower the temps down to the low 60s degrees Fahrenheit, maybe even the upper 50s if it's wintertime and I'm able to get it down that low. But I found that it does help bring out the colors. That's an old school trick that's been well known over the years. That's kind of all. I don't do any ice flushing though. I've heard about that, and there's a lot of debate on that one. It's one of those things where it's kind of he say she say. I think really, in my opinion, is forcing deficiencies in a sense, right? If the temperature of the water you're putting in is too low, it's going to slow down microbial activity, right? Those microbes are going to slow down, and there's going to be less nutrient breakdown, right? So the plant isn't going to uptake, those nutrients, and you'll see deficiencies, or you see a fade come out. I'm not sure if that's what the goal is for ice flushing, or if people are saying that trichomes are going to be better, or what the case is on that. But no, I don't do any type of ice flushing.
So when you harvest on harvest day, you chop the plant. What's your technique and stuff as far as do you wet trim? Do you dry trim? I guess could you take us through your actual harvesting process?
Sure. Yeah. So on harvest day, typically I like to just cut at the stalk, right at the base of the plant. Just do that one cut and hang it whole. Now I have done, cutting individual branches, particularly if I'm doing the scrog technique, or, I have a trellis net going. Sometimes it's difficult to just cut at the base and then rip buds through, or rip branches through that scrog net. So sometimes I'll cut individual branches. What I've learned is that if you're cutting it whole and hanging it, it could slow down the dry a little bit, because there's a little bit more moisture in it, rather than cutting individual branches and maybe that main stalk is kind of cut away, for example. So I do like to, when I can, just cut at the stalk and then hang it whole. I'll let it dry. I've done wet trim before. I've done a trim where it's half wet, half dry. I guess you could say that's the worst time to do it, to be honest, in my opinion, is when it's like, you're not fully dry yet. There's still quite a bit of moisture in there, and you try to hack away at it with the trimmers. I feel like it just so slows down the process immensely. It gunks up your trimmers so much more, and so I avoid that at all costs. Wet trim, I'll do it, if I need to. It depends on my schedule, right? It's another thing, right? If I'm going on vacation or I'm not going to be around, when a dry trim comes into play, I'll do a wet trim, but I prefer a dry trim. I just feel like it's more efficient. And I know I'm going to have people, people will comment and say, oh no, wet trim all the way. It's super subjective, right? It's super preference. But I do like a dry trim. I feel like, the right dryness, the leaves can kind of come off there pretty easily. Sometimes you don't even need to snip with the trimmers. The leaves will just kind of fall off just by brushing the trimmer next to the leaf that's about to fall off. So I found it's just a little bit easier for me to do a dry trim.
I think this is kind of another spot where environment comes into play for me. I'm always trying to think logically about like my environment and how one thing leads to the next. So if I cut my plant, I actually harvest and leave everything on. I chop at the bottom like you do. I leave the fan leaves, everything. I leave them all on. I just hang that thing upside down because I'm already in a battle against dryness and heat usually. So my plants will dry really quick. So that's why I tend to like go ahead and water all the way up till the end and keep everything on there so I can retain as much moisture as possible. Now, for somebody in a different place with a really, really humid environment, I don't know, maybe it might make sense, especially if they've got like all kinds of foliage and really dense buds. It might make sense for them to wet trim, just for that fact of keeping because the humidity's so high and they're having to add a dehumidifier and, having to battle maybe bud rot or something like that. So I think there's different techniques simply for different environments as well, or at least you can use different techniques to accommodate your environment.
I completely agree with everything you just said.
Yeah, the other thing too is I don't know why, but when I wet trim, it's just not the same for me. It doesn't look as good. When I wet trim, it's like it's so dry here and stuff that that when that trimmed product begins to dry, it really starts to kind of shrivel up. And when I dry trim, I guess for bag appeal, when I dry trim, it just looks better to me. I can kind of get in there and nip away at the stuff I don't want, and it doesn't. I don't know. Am I making sense?
Yeah. I guess I've never really looked that closely at kind of the bud structure and compared wet trim versus dry trim. But
yeah, not that I care. I don't really care about bag appeal because I'm growing for myself, but either way, as far as your environment and stuff, so when you hang the plant up, what's your ideal temperature and humidity that you're shooting for?
For drying, I think a lot of people these days would agree that lower temps and somewhat higher humidity is ideal. Now, what I'm referring to is a lot of people say 60-60 rule. So the 60% humidity, relative humidity, and then 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, sometimes for me, it's hard to get that low for a temperature. Humidity, I can add in humidifiers and I can get it stable at 55-60% is generally what I aim for. 55 to 60% relative humidity. Sometimes if it creeps up to 62%, okay. 65% is where I'm kind of taking action and I'm kind of trying to reduce it a little bit because I don't want any mold to come in there. Temperature wise, if it's 70 degrees, room temp 75 degrees, okay. The higher it goes, I feel like it jeopardizes the quality of my final product. So I do make a conscious effort to try to reduce the temperature in my dry environment. Now, I think it's well documented, and a lot of people don't know this, is that terpenes evaporate. They evaporate at different temperatures. The higher the temperature, the more terpenes are going to evaporate. So if you're drying in 80 degrees, 85 degrees, well, some of your terpenes are being evaporated. So keeping that temperature low is conserving some of those terpenes. I think that's why a lot of people go down to 60 Fahrenheit is to conserve those terpenes. And I feel like it does help, when you're that low temp, and it does help slow the drying process as well. If it's a higher temp, I feel like it dries faster. So having a slow dry, 7 to 10 days, upwards of 14 days is typically what I'll aim for. And then, like I mentioned, humidity around 60% roughly. That's what I found to be kind of the best final product for me.
Do you think something just clicked, and I'm wondering, do you think if you dry in too hot of an environment and those terpenes begin to evaporate, do you think that has anything to do with like grassy hay smell because you're kind of getting rid of terpenes, or do you think that's more chlorophyll related?
I think it would be a combination of both. I know I hear about the people having that dry grass smell. I mean, I've had it before. The thing is, if you get your conditions back on track, in the curing phase in particular, so say you do have that high dry temperature, 80 degrees, 85 degrees. I've done that before, and then when I came to the curing, I was able to get my temperature back in check, and after a few weeks or so of cure, that smell's gone away, and it actually turned into a good cure with excellent terpene profile. So I feel like probably it's a combination of both, is that grassy fresh cut grass smell, and I believe that oftentimes you can actually get rid of that just with curing.
What are your thoughts on, so do you dry in your tent, or are you drying it somewhere separately?
I've dried in so many different areas. I've closets before.
Okay.
Primarily, I do tent is primarily. So I will. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. So if you're in because I'm thinking, if you're drying in a tent, and you've got a humidifier in there, is there any danger of having that humidifier too close? Let's say, the reason I'm asking this is because right now I've got a humidifier in my tent, and the plants are taking up every square inch of this 2x4 tent, and so my humidifier, when it blows the mist out, it's it's blowing right onto some of the plant, and I keep thinking, boy, when I'm really deep in the flower, I wonder if that particular bud or if that particular spot is going to end up having so much moisture that I'm going to have an issue there. And it's just a thought, I don't know, but I was just thinking the same thing. When you're drying, if you're in a tent, a 2x4 or even a 2x2 or what have you, and you've got a humidifier in there, is that a thing? Or do you think you should keep that humidifier kind of out of the way and try to have some open space? Or do you think it blowing right on to some of the buds while they're drying could be an issue for those particular buds?
I definitely think it can be an issue, yeah. I mean, when I have my grow tent full during drying, I'll aim to point the humidifier so it goes against one of the grow tent's walls. And then also have a oscillating fan at the bottom of the grow tent that's moving air around, right? So to try to prevent those humid pockets from forming and heat pockets from forming, having that air movement go around, but not blowing the buds. I've found that when you have the fan blowing directly on the buds, it could cause that bud to dry out too quickly. But yeah, I definitely try to have the humidifier pointing against the grow tent wall, not directly onto the buds. And sometimes what I'll even do, if I can, is I will control the temperature and humidity outside of the grow environment. And then, sometimes I even have an exhaust in the grow tent. So I know that the air coming in is of the proper temperature and humidity. So I won't have to have my humidifier inside the grow tent, and it can avoid that direct blast onto the buds. And then also sometimes I'll keep my grow tent door cracked open, to make sure that it does get air flow throughout the tent. And I'll definitely have both the intake vent, the bottom rectangle vents on the tent, and even that upper ventilation sock, I'll even push that all the way up and just have that open. So that way I know air is coming through the tent sometimes, especially when I have that oscillating fan down at the bottom of the tent. Or sometimes I'll place it outside of the tent pointing into the rectangle intake vent. So I've done it so many different ways, and you can do it so many different ways. But yeah, having him blast directly onto the buds, I believe that is a concern for sure. You should definitely avoid that, in my opinion.
Yeah. So when do you typically consider your dry done? Do you use the branch snapping method, or?
Yeah, I do look at that. I do both the branch snapping method, and sometimes it's not going to be a clean snap. Sometimes I found when there's that clean snap, like a lot of people say, is the best time to stop the drying process. I found that the buds are over dry, so if there's somewhat of a snap, I guess you could say, I mean, you could still kind of feel some moisture in it. I mean, it's so subjective, but I do take that into consideration. And also I will do the bud pinching process, right? So like when you pinch in that bud, when you pinch in that bud real firm, if it goes back to normal pretty quickly, then you know that it's pretty much dry. If it stays compacted in, then you know there's still some moisture in there. So I do a combination of both when I determine when I'm going to take it out of the dry environment and then put it into jars for curing.
How often are you smelling those fingers after you're squishing those buds?
Every time, for sure.
Yeah, I found the same thing, to be honest with you. If I wait until the smallest stems like snap right in half, like crispy snap, I find that I'm battling in the cure to try to get some humidity back up a little bit even, which I'm horrible at that to begin with. It takes a lot of practice, you know that, man? It's like you got to take the time to grow these things out, and you get pretty good at growing, and then this drying and curing phase, it's just like a whole nother ballpark, man. For me, anyways.
It can be tough.
It's just a whole nother learning curve that I don't feel comfortable with yet. Even after 4 years, like I don't feel like I've got it down. I feel like it'll always be better, and like I've always, I should have done this, or I should have done that, or I waited too long. I'm always kind of kicking myself when it comes to the drying and curing. Yeah,
it can be just particularly difficult to get that drying environment balanced, right, with the 60-60, for example, if that's what you're aiming for, especially if you're exhausting the air or exchanging the air out of the grow space. You're going to have your humidity go up and down, and it can be tough. It can, there's been times where I've overdried it. There's been times where I'm 5 days into dry and I'm like, shit, these are ready to go into jars at this point. And it's not ideal in my opinion. Like I mentioned before, at least 7 days, if not 10, 14 days at max is what I aim for drying. Then I'll put them into jars. Now, when I'm putting them into jars, I do have a hygrometer in there, so I am able to kind of see what the relative humidity is inside the jars. I personally aim for about 62% RH, and then if I find that RH quickly spikes beyond that when I put them into jars, then I'll take them right out of the jars and just lay them flat on a piece of cardboard or a piece of paper and let them dry for a little while longer before I put them back into jars.
Can I ask how long you will put them in the jar before, like how much duration do you give to see that spike? I mean, either way, if it spikes, I guess you're going to do it. But like if you put it in the jar and it's at, like let's say 60, do you just keep the lid closed?
Yep, I'll keep the lid closed.
Okay. I guess I'm skipping ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I'll see it go gradually up. You know what I mean? So I'll check on it within 15 minutes after putting them in jars and seeing what it's at. And then if it's way too high, then I'm like, okay, I need to continue to dry it. So I'll take it out. If I see it and it's fine, if it's, 55%, 60%, whatever, I'll keep them in there. And let's see what it looks like 30 minutes later. And then let's see what it looks like in the hour. And then check on it a few hours from now. If it's like 2-3 hours, and it hasn't gone above that, 62%, 63%, whatever I'm aiming for, I'll keep it in the jars, and then I'll just, typically I'll burp like once a day, when I get to that point. But yeah, the first goal after putting them into jars is to get that humidity down below 65. Ideal state would be about 62%. And then I know it's somewhat stable, and then I can go to just burping once a day, just kind of opening up, shaking the jar around. If the buds stick together, Sometimes I'll take them out of the jar and make sure they're not sticking together anymore, then put them back in the jar. So, yeah, that's kind of my process for that.
I know we skipped over trimming, but I mean, trimming is trimming, and it's kind of, there's not really much to say about that, I guess. And unless you got any, anything that you are thinking about.
No, I mean, I agree with you on that avenue. There's not much really to talk about when it comes to trimming. Again, I just find that a dry trim is just a little bit easier for me, especially if I'm trying to really give a good manicure of those buds and make them give them bag appeal, I guess you can say. But for me, I'm just growing for myself, and I just I don't say half-ass trimmed, but I do leave some of the fan leaves. I'll cut off as much of the fan leaf as possible. If I don't have 100% of it off, then I'm okay with that, But if I have a bag that I'm bringing over to a friend, I live in a state where I'm allowed to gift cannabis legally. So when I'm gifting stuff, I'll go ahead and I'll take another set of trimmers to them to, give them that bag appeal. So my friends don't say, hey, what is this crap?
Yeah, I do the same thing. I've got a retired veteran neighbor, and every harvest I usually try to take him at least a half ounce, sometimes more. And I'll make sure that looks pretty dope,
Yeah.
You want to represent yourself well, I guess.
Absolutely.
Have you ever used a trim bag or anything like that? Just curious.
No, I haven't. I've just used regular hand trimmers.
Yeah, that's what I do too. So yeah, curing. So let's talk about curing, because this is where I get really confused. As far as burping, so you put all your flower in your jars, and your cure begins pretty much when you put them in there, right? Because you're sealing the oxygen off. And is that the thought process? Is that how they cure? Is like with in a sealed environment without oxygen?
Yeah, I usually use those glass mason jars is what I usually put them in. And really, curing is preserving. You're preserving that state of the cannabis, no matter what the moisture level is. You're preserving that, and I like to cure in darkness. So I'll definitely have my jars in. If I'm using those clear mason jars, I'll put them in my closet, behind clothes or whatever, to try to have that no light touching it, because light degrades the trichomes over time, right? So the last thing you want to do is have your jars just sitting on a windowsill or something. You have those trichomes turn and degrade. I also use the C-Vault containers. I'm not sure if you know what those are, but they're kind of larger containers, and I actually prefer those because I could put an entire plant within one of the containers. So when I'm doing the burping process, instead of opening up, 5 or 10 individual jars that have an ounce in them each, I can open up one big container that has, 4 ounces. I think some of the ones one of the larger containers, you can put like a whole pound in one container. So you can do up one big burp. I know some commercial facilities, they're using those 5-gallon buckets to cure, and they're just burping those. So I do try to put them all in one big container, one plant per C-Vault container, for example. And then my burping is it's a real quick thing. But yeah, I'll put them in the jars. I'll make sure that the humidity is stable at around 62%. And then usually for the first couple weeks, I'm burping once a day. I'm taking a look at the buds. I'm making sure they're not sticking together, shaking that C-Vault container. Or sometimes, if I feel like they're real stuck in those mason jars, I'll empty out the mason jar and break up the buds and then put them back in. And some people are going to argue against the burping. They say once you're at that 62% or whatever percent humidity that they're going for, then you don't have to burp from there on out. I still do. I feel like I believe that there is off-gassing happening. We know that chlorophyll breakdown is happening, so releasing that out of the containers is just something that I do. But there are people that argue against that. And then I personally won't consume. The earliest I'll consume is like 2 weeks after, into cure. But even at the 2-week mark, most of the time I'm still tasting that chlorophyll. It's not really fully cured yet. So most of the time now, when I have a stash, I'm not touching it for at least 30 days into cure. And even at that point, sometimes I could still taste a little bit of chlorophyll. So I read an article on Leafly, and you can take it or leave it as bro science, but some cultivars can take up to 6 months to fully cure until you can really have the full smell and taste come out of it. And I'm a believer of that. I mean, I feel like after the 1 month mark, when I'm opening up my jars, it just gets better and better and better every single time I open up those jars, all the way up until like the 6 month mark, or maybe even a little bit longer than that. And then I feel like, okay, this is at its peak. And then I do start to see some decline, it starts to degrade, so I am a believer of that avenue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's what I was confused about, was burping and the purpose of doing it, because a lot of people say, well, you got to burp to get the moisture out. But I would always, kind of come back and say, well, I need to sometimes I'm like throwing some stems in there or something to bring the humidity back up in that jar. Sometimes it'll dry out, and because my stuff's just always so dry, it'll dry so fast,
Yeah.
And like I said, I suck at it. So it's like I'll dry it too fast. I'll throw it in the jars, and I'll keep those little hygrometers in there, and it'll tell me it's at 49% sometimes, which is super low, isn't it?
Yeah, and I come across that same exact scenario as you. Like I put it in the jars, over dried it, put it in the jars, and it's at like 50%, 52%. And in that particular case, I do keep it in the jars for, a week, several days up to a week before I am burping, just because I want to see if I can get that moisture to come out of the middle of the buds, so it's even across the entire bud, and hopefully that potentially raises up the humidity, and does, somewhat raise up the humidity a few percentages there. Generally speaking, I've had ones come in at 50, 52%, and then left them in jars for a week or two, and then all of a sudden they're up to 58%, close to 60%, right? And I've just put in one of those humidity packs in there. I use the Bovita ones. I put one of those in there, and then it gets me right up to the 62% where I like to be. Now, some people like to do 58%. They swear by 58% is ideal. So I think that's somewhat subjective as well, as far as, what your preference is and how it smokes and things like that.
My thoughts on that, not that my thoughts are worth much, but my thoughts on that are I prefer like a little bit lower of humidity, because I mostly dry herb vape all of my flower.
Okay.
And so it vapes a little bit better when it's a little bit drier. If it's too dry, it'll be harsh and kind of burn my throat. But when if I'm smoking, I do prefer it to be a little bit, not that I'm snotty about it. I mean, I'm not like a coffee snob about it or anything, but I mean, if I have a choice though, I do like the more, the 62 range more for smoking, and the little bit less humidity more for vaping, just to throw that out there. That's just my own personal cup of tea though,
Yeah, I know there's some people out there who all they do is press their flower into rosin, right? And that needs to be at a certain percentage. I'm no expert when it comes to that. I wish I was, because I do like to do dabs every now and then. But if it's too humid, if the moisture content is too high, you're not going to get a good press. Same thing if it's too low, if it's too dry, you're not going to get a good press. So there are some people adamant about that certain percentage. I don't know what the best percentage is per se, but yeah, as far as controlling and aiming for a certain percentage of moisture level, it can be different depending on if you're just smoking the flower, or if you're vaping, like you said, or if you're pressing.
Yeah. When I get really good at it, then I'll start getting really picky. But until I can just hit the general mark, then for right now, I'm just trying to get my chops down,
And there's been flowers where it's been at 62% in the jars, and I take it out of the jars and I'm like, wow, this doesn't feel right. It feels a little bit too moist for my liking. So I do like to lower it even more. So it's strange how that happens sometimes, but yeah, I don't want people to be hard set on 62%. There is other people that say other have other preferences on what that moisture content or percentage is. I know in the commercial facilities, they're actually sticking, I believe they're sticking like a probe within the buds and finding the moisture content within the buds. That's not something that we really do on the home grow side of things, right?
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. I think it really comes down to your particular situation, your particular environment. Lately anyways, I tend to try to trim almost a little earlier than I normally would as far as like when it dries. And the reason is because I always over dry, and it ends up being really low in the jars, and then I struggle and I don't end up with very good product at the end of the day. So for me, like I almost, don't wait. Like I said, I don't wait until that branch snaps really, really crispy, because then I find that it's too dry for me. So I would rather trim them and jar them up and find that they need to dry just a tad bit longer, and I can just, if I have to, kind of spread them out on a screen, or I'm a screen printer, so I got like hundreds of screens that I can like lay out and lay buds on and dry them and stuff, if I have to. But I would rather like take them back out of the jars, let them dry for, another day or another few hours, rather than over dry them and stick them in the jars. You know what I mean? But
I'm the same way. Yep.
But somebody in the South or something, or on the East Coast or in a humid environment, they might be the opposite way, because they're battling that humidity. So again, I think it's really subjective, and it really just depends on your environment.
Yeah, I agree. And then like if I remove a branch and I start to trim it, I dried the plant, ready to trim, dry trim. If I find out that it is still kind of wet, one thing I mostly find is that the trimmers gunk up a little bit more than they would if the plant was fully dry. So I'll either stop trimming and then put it back in for another day of drying, or I'll continue to trim and just go through the process because I need to go through the process. But yeah, I do find myself doing the same exact thing, to where I might pull them out of drying a day early or a little bit early so I don't over dry, because it sounds like we're in a similar situation. We're in very dry environments, and that can certainly cause over drying to happen pretty easily.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Absolutely. Yeah, so the way I understand it then, tell me if this is kind of how you understand it too. In a perfect scenario, you would harvest where you've got, to where when you so you would dry until you get the right moisture to when you jar them up, they're, like in the low 60s or maybe even like 65%, or would that be too high? If they were like at 65%, is that when you would just really, really utilize that burping?
I'm still taking them out of the jar for a little while. You know what I mean? So if it's at 65%, and when I put them in jars, and make sure it's stable at 65%, let's say, I'll take them out of the jars. I'll let them sit for, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, put them back into the jars, and usually it'll slowly creep back up, and maybe it drops down to 64%. And then maybe I'm taking it out of the jars for a little while longer and putting it back in the jars. So I'll do that process to bring it down gradually. I think the most, probably 63% is probably the highest I would have that percentage be for when I'm keeping in the jars kind of long term. I feel like 64%, 65% or even above, you're at risk for mold to happen. That's definitely something that you want to avoid for sure.
Yeah, so if your humidity in your jars is kind of more on the higher side, then you want to continually air those things out and try to get that humidity down, because like you said, the outer portion of the flowers will dry, but the moisture will navigate and work its way out from the middle, and it will kind of continue. So until you get that stable, that's kind of the idea, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. And then if it's opposite, if your humidity, say you throw it in there and your humidity is at 55, then you're probably going to keep that sealed up, but you will burp maybe, a week into it or something, just to kind of exchange the air that's in there, but you're kind of keeping it closed so that the humidity does work its way out and raises it in the jar in particular. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, but instead of burping it on a week, I still kind of burp it every day for
Okay.
1 to 2 weeks. Because, if it's at 55%, for example, and I have in the jars at 55%, it's still going to slowly creep up as that moisture comes out from the middle. So I'll let it sit in there, and then, I will still kind of burp it, but I feel like letting it sit long term for like a week or two. I mean, there's still that off gassing that's happening is why I still continue to burp.
Right.
I know it's super debatable. I know some people are like, oh, just keep
Sure.
it in there. There's no reason to burp. Well, I still do, and I still my product turns out to be fine. I don't know. I can't say if it's beneficial one way or the other, but that's just what I do.
Yeah. Hey, man. As long as it works for you or for me or whoever the particular grower is, if you're enjoying the final product and you're the one consuming it, then really, who cares what other people say?
True.
So, yeah, man. I'm gonna have to put some of this stuff to practice then, because see, I was. Well, let me ask you this: when you do burp, if the humidity is low, let's say I've got buds in a jar and the humidity is at 55%. If you're wanting to burp, to exchange the air out and gas it out or what have you, are you just doing that for like maybe 5 minutes and not 3 hours?
Not even.
No?
Yeah, it's a good question though. The burping process for me, if it's at that 55% or whatever, it's just a quick burp. It's removing the lid of the container, removing the hygrometer that I have in there, shaking the buds, doing a quick shake in the jar, and then really putting it back on. So I would say within, it's like a 10-second, 15-second process for that type of burp. Now, if it's higher up, maybe if it's in the low 60s and I'm burping, maybe it's 62, 63% or whatever, I'll remove that container. Maybe I have like a bunch of different containers. Like, let's say, for example, I have 10 different mason jars. Mm-hmm. Well, I'll go ahead and I'll open up that first mason jar. I'll shake the buds around. I'll place that down, open up the next mason jar, shake the buds around. I'll leave the lid off of the first one, and I'll kind of work my way around. So I'll be all 10 jars will have their lids off. Then when I'm putting the jars back on, I'll go ahead and go back, putting the lids back on. I'll go back to that first jar and put that lid on first. So that'll be a little bit longer of a burp, I guess you can say.
Okay.
But does it make a difference? I don't know.
Yeah.
That's just what I do, right? There's no science behind it yet.
Yeah, like I said, if it works for you and you like it, man,
Yeah.
whatever your technique is. So then after, let's say once it's cured, let's say within, 6 weeks, or maybe one particular cultivar might be 2 months or even 6 months. Once you establish that it's cured and it's where you like it, are you burping like once a month or anything like? I've heard burp it once a month, even if you have it for a year. Although I usually consume mine far before that. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, the general knowledge is to burp it once a month. That's kind of the general consensus behind it. I can't say that I burp it every month on the certain day that it needs to be burped, right? I do have some jars that have been sitting around for several months. But I know that they are in the proper humidity range, and they're in darkness, and that the temperature is proper. So I'm not really worried about it. But yeah, generally speaking, once a month is when I do the burp. And then, I've had bud that's been a year and a half, 2 years, and it doesn't become. I almost get to the point where I want to throw it away. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I'll try to press it out. Sometimes it won't press out because even after, I feel like even when they're in jars, they'll slowly still kind of lose its humidity in a sense. I've been opening up those jars and consuming the cannabis as I'm, as I'm going along. So that's naturally lowering the humidity in there. But yeah, it starts to degrade for sure after like the year and a half mark, and then it's not nearly as good as it was at like the 2-year mark. But hey, you can still consume it. I still consume it, and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, even when I open my jars just to get some out and grind some or something, it's like because I use mason jars as well. I'll pull a nug out and like I'll put that like seal lid thing like right back on the mason jar, so because it'll just over time, man, it'll open in that thing multiple times a day. That stuff just dries out on me, you know.
Yep.
Especially
absolutely.
if it's like, you know, if I got my air conditioner on in the summertime, it'll, you know, the humidity in my house will be like, you know, 13% or something sometimes, man. It's just freaking dry.
Yeah, I'm the same way. That's a good point. I mean, for me and you, it's going to be different to somebody who is in a environment that's 60%, right? If you're just hanging out in your room and it's 60%, well, then you can take the lid off your jar and not be as concerned as we are,
right?
Because 60% is fine, you know. So it won't dry out nearly as fast as us, which we're at 13% or 20% RH, you know. It will quickly dry out, you know. So even taking off the lid for a minute or two, it has a significant impact on it, I believe.
Yeah, especially over time, you know. Yeah. Especially over time. Well, Chris, man, I really appreciate your time, dude. Thanks for coming on and giving us Siberian ditchweed growers a little bit of love. I really appreciate it, man. Really appreciate you sharing your knowledge, and I'll be sure to drop all of your links and to all the podcasts, your YouTube channel, your Instagram, everything in the show notes. And yeah, man, I'm just super grateful, dude. I really am super grateful for you coming on. But
oh man, it was good. I've tuned into your podcast. I've listened to probably a small handful of your episodes, and love the quality. Love what you're doing. Love how, you know, your attitude, your way that you go about things. I mean, you clearly realize that there are so many different ways to go about it, and we as people don't know everything there is to know about this plant. So we got a long way to go, and the episodes I've listened to have been very entertaining, and yeah, keep it up.
I appreciate that,
continuing to tune in.
I greatly appreciate that. Awesome, dude. Well, thank you so much, man. Thank you so much for listening, you guys. I appreciate each and every one of you. Be sure to follow Mr. GrowIt's podcasts, social media, and to check out his book. All the links are in the show notes for you. Go give him some love and thank him for sharing his knowledge with us. Much love to you all, and happy growing. See ya.
Nicotine, alcohol, good drugs. Coincidentally, tax drugs. Ooh, how does this fucking work?
The dried leaves and berries are ground up and made into cigarettes by a simple hand machine. The deadly narcotic is thus quickly and easily prepared for its market. The sale of marijuana is even more difficult to detect and halt than the traffic in drugs such as opium, morphine, and heroin.